auntie, uncle, I know English better than you. Oh, I'm calling and I'm out of breath and I'm like, guys, I got a job. I got a full-time job. You know you're black, right? Hi guys, welcome to this week's episode of Madvocate Mondays. I wanted to talk about race and racism because we love talking about it as black people. But really, what I really wanted to discuss today is my experience of racism and race issues in Australia. If you've watched my channel, you know I'm an African Australian. I lived in Australia for 13 years, moved back to Kenya recently. So I have an understanding, or I have some experiences that I've been through as an African in Australia, as a black person in Australia, that contribute to the discourse in relation to racism and race issues and that sort of stuff. I'm talking, specifically from my personal experience. I feel like that's more accurate in terms of depicting what life was like as a black person for me in Australia. So, you can't talk about race in Australia without acknowledging Indigenous Australians, right? Because Indigenous Australians have suffered genocide since, the 19th century. Initially, it was genocide by bullets, and then it just became a systemic genocide in the sense of mass incarceration, and even down to food and diet and what they're eating, because lifestyle diseases are so common with Indigenous Australians because they're originally hunter-gatherers. So they would hunt and gather their food, whereas now if you provide an Aboriginal person with a bale of white flour and coke and that sort of thing, what you're doing is setting them up for disaster because genetically that's not what they consumed. And so you find a lot of Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal people suffering from lifestyle diseases and that sort of stuff. So it's, again, that's why I call it a systemic genocide, because you might not be killing them with bullets anymore, but you're killing them in the sense that you're, first of all, you've taken away their native land, and so they're not able to do the hunting and the gathering that they used to do. And then on top of that, providing them with food that is not nutritious to their bodies and their genetics. You can't ignore the issue of the atrocities that have happened to Aboriginal people in Australia. It's extremely sad. If you want to educate yourself more on this issue, I would recommend that you watch a documentary called The First Australians. The Australian government still hasn't made things right. We still have sectors of Australia that won't even acknowledge Indigenous people's rights to native title to the land. And so things like that are extremely frustrating. And so Australia, which is a migrant nation already, has Indigenous people's issues as the backdrop. As an African person, as a black person in Australia, I moved to Australia having never considered my color, the color of my skin, right? Because I was born in Kenya. You never talk about whether you're black. The things that I experienced here in terms of skin is colorism, because in Kenya, I remember growing up, light-skinned girls were preferred to darker-skinned girls. So I remember a lot of people wanting to bleach. I remember we had a house help who used to use bleaching creams, and I remember stealing her bleaching creams one time because I was just like, well, maybe this is the in thing to do. But, other than colorism issues, I can't say that I really ever even turned my mind to the color of my skin. What I distinctly remember growing up is consuming a lot of American media and American books. And so I wanted to be blonde with blue eyes because that's all I saw in magazines. That's all I saw in the novels, the descriptions of the women in the novels that I read. And that's what I saw on TV. When I did sneak in some television, which wasn't, cartoons or news, what did I see? I saw The Bold and the Beautiful, Days of Our Lives, that sort of thing. So that was the standard of beauty for me. I never saw someone on screen who looked like me, who had kinky hair, who I never saw that. So the standard of beauty for me was blonde, blue eyes, because that's what was described as beautiful. So I remember, you know, wanting my hair to be straightened. I was the same with all my friends. We had permed hair. We wanted it to fly in the wind, even though the way it grows from my roots it's not intended to fly in the wind. But you just, because that's what you saw on TV. Anyway, other than that, I never really thought of my blackness as anything to even think about, because I'm an African. I grew up in an African country, so it went without saying that I'm black. When I moved to Australia, however, my Africanness or my blackness was very evident in the form of comments from other people. So I would go to uni orientation and talking to people and people being like, oh my God, when did you come? And I'd be like, oh, I came last week. I'd be like, and your English is that good? Huh? And constantly getting these comments, how is your English so good? Wow, your English is so good. It got to a point I would say, you too, oh my gosh, your English is really good as well. Because I thought it was a joke at first. I really didn't pay much attention to it until it became a continuous thing. You know, in uni, when classes started, people asking, you know, how did you learn English so fast? If you came to Australia in July, you know, now it's August, we're in uni. How did you learn English so fast? And I was like, is this auntie serious? Like I couldn't understand the comments, right? It became frustrating for me to keep answering the same question over and over again. What we were experiencing as black people in Adelaide was what I consider to be mostly lack of knowledge, right? Like the questions would get, like you'd meet an older white couple on the street and they'd be like, oh my God, your hair. And I'd be like, what about it? Because I went to Australia in braids. It's an unremarkable thing for an African person to have braids. But in Adelaide, it was just so fascinating to white people. The exhausting thing for me personally was having to repeat the same answer over and over and over again. It's not that I feel that those questions are racist. I don't. I look at the intent of the person asking, because most people, and I'll say in my personal experience, about 9 times out of 10, people were genuinely interested. They had probably never interacted with an African before and never knew any history about Kenya, about Africa, you know, in general. Some of them thought that South Africa is a continent and Kenya must be a country in South Africa or something like that. Like they just didn't know any history about Africa to be able to put anything in context. The media that they consumed about Africa was always about people in need, and it wasn't a balanced view of what Africa actually is. I didn't generally take the stand that, oh my God, people are racist because they're asking me questions about my hair and my skin and my English. I just was frustrated that I had to keep answering the same question over and over and over again. What that made me realize is that there's stereotypes in people's minds, in a majority of people's minds, about African people. And the stereotypes are, 1, that we don't know English, and 2, that we must be so happy and so lucky to be in Australia because we must have escaped some sort of war back in our motherland. You have different kinds of migrants. You have, you know, humanitarian migrants, you have skilled migrants, and you have students like myself. I migrated to Australia initially as a student, but a majority of the Anglo population of Australia has no idea which category you fall into. Like, so many of them were just like, oh, you're a bit lighter than your other Sudanese brothers and sisters, because there's a huge population of South Sudanese people in Australia, and that's what a lot of Anglo-Australians, that was their point of reference. So the danger with that sort of mentality is when it comes to getting opportunities that will progress you in life. We've all heard the saying, it's not what you know, it's who you know. I think this applies everywhere in the world, because even in Australia, right, there were so many resources and so much information that I could have needed when I was a student that I simply had no idea about, and no one was telling me about them because I didn't have those connections that my Anglo counterparts had. And so whether it's, you know, being able to shadow a judge, I just didn't have any opportunities to have those industry connections that would have helped me start my career a lot earlier than it did. It would have helped me advance a lot quicker than I did. My personal experience in terms of race and racism was largely a lack of opportunities. So for instance, when I was in uni studying my media degree, we had a career advice day from one of the commercial television stations in Australia. And I was so excited because at the time, my dream, or what I thought my dream was to be on television, on the news or something. So I was just like, oh my God, we're getting, you know, someone who works in the news. This is going to be really exciting. And so they came and they talked to us. And I went and talked to this lady who was a news anchor. And she said to me, she's like, oh, you're not going to be a news anchor because you don't have an Australian accent. And just sort of moved on from there. And I was like, oh, okay. But I speak well. Like, these are the thoughts I was thinking. I wasn't saying this out loud. Oh, what does having accent have to do with anything? Like, as long as you understand what I'm saying, isn't that the point? And she was just so blatant about it. She was just like, nah, don't bother, you know, applying for the internship. You're not gonna get it because you don't have an Australian accent. I was crushed. I was truly crushed. I didn't do this consciously, but subconsciously I erased the thought of me being on Australian television. Completely erased it from my mind because I was just like, well, I guess I'm never gonna be on television. And that was more amplified by the fact that there was no one like me on television in Australia. No one I saw from African descent who was a news anchor, who was, you know, a radio personality. There was none. So I was like, oh, I guess she's right. And I sort of just let that go and let that dream go and carried on with life. That's really the danger about stereotypes and wrong beliefs about a particular group of people. You know, potentially lost out on many opportunities because people probably saw me and had already prejudged, already put me in a particular box that does not know English box, and just, you know, dismissed me on that basis. And that's the thing about racism and race issues, is a black person like me living in Australia wants to know that I am seen and I am heard based solely on my merit and not because of the color of my skin. I can't tell you how many jobs I applied for and never even got a phone call, or never even got to the interview stage, or even feedback about my application. I put this down to a general ignorance in the Australian population about the abilities of African people. There's a massive ignorance about who we are, where we're from, why we're in Australia, and what we can contribute to the society. The problem of painting everyone with the same brush is that as an organization, you miss out massively on a broad range of ideas, of thought process, personalities, experience. How much richer would organizations be if they actually focused on inclusivity? Like if they actually forgot about the name of a candidate and focused on the person in front of them, sitting in front of them in an interview room, right? Because that's the problem. A lot of us don't even get into interview rooms simply because there's a stereotype that we don't know English. And in my career, especially in law, obviously you have to be very conversant with English. A majority of my applications were not even considered because there's already a bias that my name means that I don't know English. Do you understand? Even though I had to do English tests to even make it to Australia. Auntie, uncle, I know English better than you. The other massive way that I experienced racism or race issues was when I eventually started working in my career, in a legal career. If you've watched my channel, you know I've talked about my career in employment law. I worked in Adelaide and in Melbourne for over 5 years in employment law. I never saw anyone who looked like me who was an employment lawyer. Not one. Let's go to even getting my first job representing people in this area. I mean, it had gotten to the point when I was applying for jobs. I got my first legal full-time job in February of 2015. I had finished my law degree in 2013. I still couldn't find internships. I still couldn't find jobs despite numerous applications. When I tell you, I was actually even denied internship opportunities, which is working for free, right? So by the time 2015 was coming round, I had given up. Honestly, mentally, I had given up on getting a job, and I had started giving my stuff away because I was just like, you know what? I'm gonna leave the country because I'm not getting my job. My parents were still supporting me financially, and I was just like, this is just a burden on them. I didn't come to Australia to study law to be a bartender for the rest of my life. And no, there's no issue with bartending. It's just not what I wanted to do. So I'd apply for tons and tons and tons of jobs, and I was getting nowhere. And then I got an interview for my first job. And I went to the interview. I interviewed really well. And at the end of the interview, one of the interviewers said to me, we really like you, but you don't have experience, and we're concerned that you don't have any experience. And at that point, I had nothing to lose. And I said to them, well, if you're concerned about my lack of experience, you should hire me so I can get experience. Like at that point, I was so fed up about the whole you have no experience thing, because first of all, where am I gonna get experience when no one will even call me for an interview? Because in my head, I was like, if you call me for the interview, I'm killing it. I had given myself no other option. You go in the room, you kill it. So that if you're not getting the job, it's not because of something that I've done. And so they sort of chuckled, and next thing I knew, I was called the next day and told I had the job. When I tell you, I was at my friend's house, I'll never forget this. She had a big backyard. Shout out Vicky and Alphonse. And I started running around the backyard. Running around the backyard, like screaming with joy, because I was just like, I can't believe this, I can't believe this, I can't believe, like I couldn't believe that someone had said yes after so many no's, after so many rejections. I called my parents and I was like, what the hell? You will never believe what and I'm making this call still running around because I'm one of those people, when I get excited, I need to expend energy immediately. Oh, I'm calling and I'm out of breath and I'm like, guys, I got a job. I got a full-time job. I was beside myself. And I'm so glad I got that call when I was at Vicky's house, because she was a witness to the call. Because an hour later, I was just like, did I imagine that? Did I make that up in my head? Was that real? Did I actually get that call? And she was like, yeah, it's real. You were running around in the backyard. I was like, oh, cool. I got the job. I say all this just to say, this is the danger with painting people with the same brush, with failing to give people opportunities simply because they don't look like you. First of all, it's so demoralizing and demeaning to Black people to constantly have to prove themselves 10 times over in order to get the same opportunities as their Anglo counterparts. When I can guarantee you, employing Black people, African people, people who look different from you, people who were raised different from you, can only enrich your business, can only enrich your company, because you get to have a different perspective. You get to have a different voice. You get to have a different background, and that contributes to the richness of any particular organization. When I tell you that I left every workplace that I was in better than I found it, that is a fact, because I know who I am. I know what I can bring to the table. That means that I know that me coming to your organization will be of benefit to both of us. And even starting off in a job where I had no previous experience, I knew I'm a quick study. I know I'm a fast learner. I knew that I would be able to not only adapt, but move ahead very quickly, because I give myself no other choice. I have to succeed in whatever I put my mind to. And so me knowing that was very frustrating when I didn't get opportunities, because I was just like, man, like, I know I would be great in such and such a position, but the decision makers don't look like me. The decision makers don't sound like me. So they're looking at me like, I don't know if we should, I don't know if we can. Or they're looking at my resume going, yeah, her name is hard to pronounce, so no. That's the other thing, right? If you're a white person in a decision-making capacity, can you review your workplace? Can you review your company and look at who is in leadership positions? Who makes final decisions? Do they have a different perspective? Do they all look like you? Because I can tell you right now, had there been African decision makers in the places I was applying to, I would have gotten a job way quicker than I did. I wouldn't have lost hope along the way as quick as I did, because there would have been representation in those rooms. Racial issues are now at the forefront of conversation around the world because of discussions about police brutality. There's been numerous deaths in Kenya because of police brutality since the pandemic began. There's been police brutality in America, ongoing, senseless killings of Black people. These are the prejudices we really need to address. Like, it really starts at a very low level. It's not about violence on the street. It really starts at a very basic level, which is who's in our classrooms teaching kids, what media are they being exposed to, who are the decision makers, who are the people who have a seat at the table, right? Even in my career as a lawyer, I had judges who never, ever, ever spelled my name right, pronounced my name right, regardless of how many times I said it. And the person who can't pronounce my name is probably called Mesvinsky. And they can't say Bogwa. I mean, come on. You know, my other full-time job in Australia was spelling out my names. Legit. I had to spell out my names at every turn. It is frustrating to have to keep justifying your existence. It's very, very frustrating. So that's the kind of racial issues that I dealt with on a personal level, both in my profession and in my personal life. It's just never-ending episodes of me having to spell out my name or being called Mr. because people hadn't met me and had received an email from me and thought, this must be a guy because it's a lawyer, must be a guy. Like, it's the never-ending bias that is frustrating. But like I said before, for me, the intent is what matters. If you're a white person and you are curious about African people or other ethnicities or other nationalities, I'm the type of person who I'd rather you ask me, you know? Ask me if you're curious about something. So for instance, I don't belong in the you can't touch my hair camp. I'm more of, you can touch my hair if you ask for permission. And I have very close white friends. We've played with each other's hair. A lot of the times, if you're an African person, you're probably the only African person they've interacted with on a close basis. So there's genuine curiosity, there's genuine interest. And it goes both ways. Like, even for me, Australia was the first time I was interacting with a lot of white people at the same time. Like, yes, there's white people in Kenya, but, you know, obviously they're not the majority. So I look at the intent, and I'd rather someone come to me and say, hey, I'm curious about such and such a thing. Like, and that's what I would love the most, is if people either took the time to learn or ask genuine questions with an intention to learn, so that we can actually move forward. There is a conscious or subconscious bias that each of us has. There's inherent prejudices that we all have, and that's where the conversations should start. who are the decision makers in the room, who has a seat at the table. If your table is not inclusive and representative, restructure your table. Get a more diverse group of people making final decisions. That's when the real change starts. It doesn't start any other way. Representation is truly, truly important. And so as we go through this worldwide revolution, worldwide pandemic, I'm sending love to every Black person who is struggling, who has had a very emotional few weeks. I know I've avoided the media, especially the news. I'm sending a lot of love to my American brothers and sisters. I'm sending a lot of love to my indigenous brothers and sisters. I'm sending a lot of love to my Kenyan brothers and sisters. We will get through this. The biggest hope is that all this pain is not in vain. Ooh, that rhymed. And I will see you next week.